¿Crees? Christos enviado. Jesus is risen. I have a couple examples for you to show you guys here tonight. I'll bring them out here in a bit. I'm really proud of this teen ministry group. We only get to keep the whole group here for another 7 weeks, and then half of them go on to bigger things. And then we're going to fulfill the spots with more teens. So I'm super excited, super proud. First and foremost, praise be to God. God is so good. He's been so good to our teen ministry group, and we're seeing lots of growth. We're seeing some of the best attendance. We're seeing some of the best effort. And I love where this teen ministry is going. I mean, if we go back 4 or 5 years of where we started and where we're here, I'm just excited what's going to happen in the next 5 years. If we did this good with God and in the most difficult year, I'm excited for the future years, regardless of what's going on around us. A couple months back, I heard a phrase, and I'm going to share that here with you guys tonight. I heard a phrase, and it goes like, the energy you sow is the energy you grow. The energy you sow is the energy you grow. It's so true. When you are given forth energy, it's contagious. You get other people excited. And I'm really excited what God is doing in the teen ministry group. And there's an even more important phrase that we read in scriptures, and I want us to read it, and it's in Galatians. You might know this in chapter 6, verse 7 through 9. I'm going to read that passage. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. And let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. You may be seated. The question here tonight is, do we reap what we sow? In other words, when you put in good, do you get good out? And the question itself isn't really complicated, but it kind of depends on how you look at it. How do you look at the question, and how do you define good? Or even if we deserve good in the first place. You see, the reason this question may be hard to answer is because we live in time. When do we get good back? If we're doing good, and you're sowing forth good, when do you get good back? Is it a season? Is it a few seasons? Is it a year? Is it a few years? Is it your whole lifetime? When do we see the return for our investment, so to say? The sow and the reaping. How soon do we reap what you sow? Do good things happen just because you're a Christian? Sometimes we have this understanding that since I'm faithful, good things should be happening to me. So if you reap what you sow, and you're putting in good and you're not getting good out, and you're having something bad happen in your life, are you sowing and are you reaping? We're going to talk about that tonight. Sometimes we say the good things come from God, but we don't accept the bad things that happen. We live in this concept built around time. So because we live in time, we apply everything in our life with time, regardless of it's either your family, your career, your spiritual things. We apply time to that concept. So the reaping and sowing, we do that same thing. We're waiting for something good to happen in our life. And if we don't see a certain thing good happen in our life, we begin to ask questions like, when will I finally get to see that good? Or when will I finally have this or that? Or when will God finally answer my prayer? Or I've been doing everything God's ways, but he hasn't answered my prayer. You're waiting for an answer. We're waiting for that good to happen back in your life. And you see, in each of those moments, we're applying time to God, who doesn't live in time. He lives outside of the concept of time. And when Paul talks about the law of this reaping and sowing, is he talking about what we are thinking in regards to reaping and sowing? Or does he mean something else here? When Paul writes about the law of sowing and reaping, he's not applying this to everything in your life. He's not applying this to good, a general concept of good. In verse 8, he says, if you sow to your flesh, or in simpler terms, if you're living for this world, if you're living for yourself, you're going to reap corruption. You're going to have problems. You're going to reap destruction if you're reaping into yourself, into your flesh. But he that soweth to the Spirit will reap life everlasting. Notice it doesn't say if you're sowing good, if you're doing good. It's saying if you sow it to the Spirit, you'll be blessed. Your spiritual life will be blessed. Doesn't mean everything good is going to happen in your life. See, there's a lot of churches out there today that preach prosperity. They say if you're doing good and you're a Christian, you're going to have a good life. You're going to be rich. You're going to have all these great things. But that's not what the Bible's saying. This passage doesn't talk about good things happening in your life all the time because you're doing good. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck in this mentality of, hey, I'm doing good. How come I'm not rich? How come I don't have great things? How come good things aren't happening in my life? You can't do that. You got to understand the Bible the way it's written towards these concepts. And to better, facilitate the concept, let's look at Job. I guess let's recap the story of Job. We see a man who has family, he has business, he's wealthy, he has everything he needs. He's a righteous man. And then we have God and Satan having a conversation about his righteousness, right? So then God decides that he's going to prove his wisdom and providence, and he's going to allow Satan to interfere in Job's life. He's going to allow a problem into a righteous man's life. Have you ever had a problem in your life? You had a problem in your life, one or two? No? I'm the only one with problems. Job has a big problem. He gets sick, right? He starts losing some of his blessings that he's had. And this book is a perfect answer to the question we've all heard of before. Why do bad things happen to good people? You'll hear that question from some unbelievers, some people that want to challenge your faith. Or they'll ask something like, why does God allow his children to suffer? If your God is so good, why does he allow good people to suffer? You've heard that question before? This is a perfect book and a perfect example of why God does that. God answers this by he's exposing your weakness and sinfulness in order to strengthen your faith and to have you purify yourself. Sometimes we misunderstand it where I must be in sin when something bad is happening in my life. And maybe that's true. Sometimes when you're not living by God's ways, bad things will happen to you. When you're not on the right path and you're making mistakes, God's going to throw out his whip and he's going to make sure you're in line. But sometimes you're living a good life for God, you're living for Jesus, you're serving, and you have a problem in your life. Job had that. Job had a problem in his life even though he was although he was righteous. Bad things happen in his life not because of his sin. Throughout the chapters, Job's friends accuse him of committing some great sin. We read that in the chapters. They say, hey, you're suffering because you're sinning. Job, you reaping what you're sowing, and that's why bad things are happening in your life. And they accuse him. And although his friends are accusing him, he knows he's righteous before God, but yet he doesn't blame God. He doesn't quit being faithful. He doesn't stop doing good, and he's sowing in his spirit. He's not sowing into his flesh. He's living for God. And although he's limited at what he has, he's still sowing into his spirit, and we can read that in the chapters. You can see him struggling. You can see him going through the motions, but he hasn't left God. He hasn't blamed God. I'd like us to pay close attention to Job's character. In specific, I'd like us to look at two separate concepts. The first one is God gives, God takes. In Job chapter 1, verse 21, we read, the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's what Job says after some pretty bad things happen in his life. He says, God gave, he can take. That shows us where he's at spiritually. A lot of times when God takes in our life, we begin to panic. Like, why? We start asking questions. We see God when he blesses us, but when there's hardships in our life, we tend to not take it from God. It's easier said than done, obviously. And I'm sure a lot of us have a lesson or two to remember from that. And this concept goes hand in hand with the sow and reap. God gives and he takes away, and maybe right now you're going through a season where God's giving. Keep going, keep giving God blessing. He's giving you something great right now. You're living in blessing right now. You're going through a really good time. That's great. But God's also going to give you some hardships in your life. And you've probably gone through some hardships, or you might be going through a hardship right now. Maybe you're not sharing it with everybody else around you, but you may be going through a very difficult time right now. Maybe you're battling a certain sin right now. Maybe your family's experiencing some really big problems. Maybe your child, maybe your relative, maybe your family. But this book shows us of when we sow into our spirit, the blessing that we reap and the kind of blessing that we reap. It's never an easy place to be when God is taking from us. When God is not blessing you with an easy life or easy finances, when you're living paycheck to paycheck, or when you don't know what's going to happen next month, or you've lost your job, or there's some change in your life going on, or your family. Maybe you're there because of your own faults. Maybe you've sinned and you do need to come clean with God. But maybe you're going through a hardship not because of a certain sin that you've committed, but God's testing you. He's trying to make you stronger. He's trying to show you your dependence on Him. So we must begin to look at our problems in a different way. We must begin to look at our problems at a time where we can grow and be more faithful with God, overcoming the hardships and using those around you to uplift you and make you strong. Hopefully you have a friend or two that can encourage you when you're having problems. A lot of times we tend to just lock ourselves in. We're having a problem, we're going to overcome this ourselves. I hope that you have someone you can share your problems to, because that's when the church is really strong. When you can share your problems with one another and pray for one another, that's how you overcome a lot easier. The second concept from the story I'd like to take is small faith, small God. Small faith equals a small God. When your faith is small, you're not showing a large, big God that's above us. You're showing a small God. I'm going to show you guys an example because I believe that examples help us understand concepts better. And Jesus taught parables and He showed examples. So I'm going to show you guys something. And perhaps you've seen this before. If you have, I want you to raise your hand. How many of you guys have ever seen one of these weird-looking boxes, colorful-looking boxes? All the kids are raising their hand. Parents? Okay, okay, yes, good, okay. Some parents have tried this complicated cube called the Rubik's Cube, right? How many of you guys have ever messed this up and put it back together? I do want to see hands. Okay, we have two. We have two here. And, okay, look at that. There you go. The creator of this cube, when the creator made this cube, it took him 30 days to put it back together. So he messed it up and he's okay, cool. I know I can make it back together. How? So you begin twisting it and trying it. See, most of us will mess this up and try to put it together, and we'll get one side right back together, for example. I'm not good at this. I've never put it back together. I'll be honest. I might ask Pastor Lillian to help me with this. So we put one side together, but the whole rest of the cube is still messed up. And we're trying to figure out how we can put it back together without messing up that one side. Because we're so proud of this one side that we put together. We're like, okay, how do I fix this without messing up this side that I put together? That's like our spiritual life so many times. We're not ready for God to really work in our life. We got some progress with God, we're good, but we're scared to see where He's going to lead us. We're scared to see how He's going to show us how to solve our complicated problem. We have this little problem and we can't fix it, and we're not ready to take a leap of faith and mess that side back up in order to then get the second side, the third side, and put it back together and solve your problem. Perhaps your life right now is a messed up Rubik's Cube. Maybe you're a little hot mess right now. You're trying to figure things out in your life. And you think, this is really hard. But maybe you've never seen other people's problems. You think your life is hard, and then this happens. Okay, hands. How many of you guys have ever completed one of these? Where's the hand? Who am I missing? Okay, because then that's who I go to when I mess this up, okay? I want to make sure I can put this back together. I haven't even tried this one, okay? But this is complicated. Some people's problems are this complicated. You think your life is hard. Look at other people around you. You begin to look at your problem, and your problem is not that difficult, actually. Other people are going through a lot harder things. This is a 3x3, and this is a 5x5, almost double. The only way to solve the Rubik's Cube is to mess it up in order to make it right. It's counterintuitive, really. In order to fix it, you need to mess up the side you just fixed to make sure you can fix the other side. It's complicated. The person who created this is a genius, really. But our life is very complicated. It's like a Rubik's Cube. It's like a messed up Rubik's Cube. Every single day you're working on to perfecting it. And sometimes you got to work longer times. The world record to solve this Rubik's Cube is 3.5 seconds. So I can mess this up as much as I want. I give it to him and he fixes it in 3.5 seconds. That's insane. I mean, I don't know who can do it here in 3.5 seconds. If someone can, you might be in the Guinness Book of Records. Try to beat 3.48 and you'll be in the Guinness Book of Records until someone else beats it again. That's pretty fast. It's incredible. If you have some time and some productive time, you can go on YouTube and you can actually look at the guy who does it. And then you see so many people actually build events just to try to beat that time. You'll see dozens and dozens of people competing for that time just to be the next one to beat the record. This is actually a really, really hard thing to put back together unless you have the right direction. You see, many of us will cheat. There's two different things you could do. You could break it apart and then put it back together and say, I did it. No one will know. Unfortunately, you can't solve your life problems that way. There's no shortcut to seeing God's blessing in your life. There's no cheat codes. If you mess this up, you can go on YouTube, read a book, ask a friend that's already solved it here, and this becomes so much easier. Many times when we have problems in our life, we're not asking for advice. We're not seeking God. We're not seeking His words. We're not asking those around us, and we begin to question why I'm not seeing any progress. Listen, you need to use your resources, and your problem becomes so much easier to solve. So much easier. Then, this is not that bad, because you've already fixed things. But many times, our life, and you think I'm bringing a bigger box, but I'm not. Most of the time, our problems are like this, fixed. Like you can mess this up as much as you want, but it probably takes you a couple minutes to put it back together because there's only it's a 2x2. It's made for little kids to get them ready for this one. So many times your life is not that bad. You just need some directions. You need some inspiration, and you need to get over and understand that with God, all things are possible. Do you have a small God or do you have a big God? How big is your faith? Because usually our faith is like this, but our problem is like this, and you have a little complicated matter. Job's life was none of these. Job's life looked like this. I'm going to show you this box, and you're going to be like, no way. These exist? Yes, these exist. So you have, we'll put them in order. We'll have this little one, small one, medium, and then you have Job's complicated problems. It has 12 sides. Job lost everything. Everything. And even though he lost everything in his life, sometimes we lose something. And we're panicking. And we're blaming God. But when you lose everything and you still remain faithful in God, that's a strong faith. That's showing a big God that's living. How big of a God are we showing today? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, we read, "There had no temptation taking you, but such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it." God doesn't give you a problem you can't solve. Maybe you're working through a problem like this and you're still learning. Maybe you're going through a very difficult problem. But God hasn't left you. He didn't just give you the box and give you no resource. He's giving you directions. We know how to overcome problems. The issue is we don't go to the solution. We try to figure out with different ways. It's like when your parents help you and they tell you what to do, and you're like, I'm going to try it my way first, and then I'll try it my dad's way. And you fail because Dad's giving you a proven method to fix it, and you're like, no, I'm going to try this first. And God's giving you a way to deal with problems, but we don't use them. So if you still have a box at home like this, a Rubik's Cube at home, there's ways to master it, and there's ways to fix it. It's really, really simple. There's just a series of algorithms and turns that you do, to put it back in order? Do we do that with our spiritual lives? The problem you're having today is a problem you'll be solving tomorrow. We live in time. We want things faster. We want things to be fixed sooner and easier. But God says there's nothing you can't overcome if you're doing it with God. That's the key right there. A lot of times we think, oh, I can't, God's giving me too much to handle. Well, you're not trying to overcome the problem with God. You're trying to do it by yourself. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13 reads, I can do all things through whom that strengthens me. Through him. You can do all things through him. Mark 10:27, it reads, with man it is impossible. Jesus says, with man it is impossible, but not with God. For all things are possible with God. You see, we don't read it here. We're not reading about some things are possible with God. Because then you're limiting your God. All things are possible through him. And when you are battling through problems with him, big God mentality, you're showing a big faith and you're showing a big God. Matthew 13:31. Chapter 13. Incredible example about how the smallest of seeds can grow into the largest tree. I have one more tiny example. If you're in the back, you may not see this. If you're watching online, maybe the cameras will pick this up. This is a little jar of like 50 mustard seeds. If there was just one in here, you wouldn't see it. It's microscopic. It's small. So we read about the mustard seed and how much of a big blessing it becomes into a tree and how now it's a shade for the birds. Matthew 13:31. Let's read it. Another parable he put forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs. It becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. So when you choose to start sowing into your spiritual life, you begin to look at life very differently. Things in your life change. I was telling the teens about a certain young gentleman who used to be a real jerk when he was younger. Just completely reckless. He was smoking, he was drinking, bad group of friends. And he went to high school that my wife used to go to. This is years ago. I was like your guys' age. And he was reckless. And, then high school was over, he graduated, and we got to see him a few years later. And my wife points out to him and says, hey, that's that guy, remember? We noticed, we recognize him. And I'm like, oh man, I hope he doesn't recognize us. He was reckless. He was a lot. And he came up to us, and he greeted us, and he was a whole different man. Whole different guy. Greeted us, asking how we were doing. And I asked him, hey, what happened? He got to know Jesus. He accepted Jesus. And when he accepted Jesus into his life, he started sowing into his spirit. He changed. His group of friends changed. His habits changed. And that's what happens when we're sowing into our spirit. Your group of friends change. Where you spend your money changes. Your lifestyle changes. What you do with your time changes. Your family changes. Everything changes when you get to know Jesus. But many times we're not sowing into our spirit, and then we start asking the question of, why is God not working in my life? We get lazy. We're looking for a quick, get-rich-quick strategy to being close with God, and there isn't one. It's a daily task to grow with God. It's a relationship. There's no get-quick spiritual method. It doesn't exist. Everyone has to start somewhere. Starting is always the hardest part. Building something, anything you do, it's always the hardest part. We all know that. It's the same thing in our spiritual life. We start with something little, like this mustard seed. And we water it, and we water it, and we nurture it, and we keep it away from harsh sun and bad things. And then we see it start growing. And then you start seeing some branches grow, and you're getting excited. And then eventually you start seeing the branches expand. And then you start seeing the fruit. It's such a blessing when you get to see the fruit. You start affecting other people's lives. You are able to be used by God, and it's powerful and it's great. But you have to start somewhere. A lot of times we don't even want to start. We start asking the difficult questions, but we haven't even planted the seed. Why isn't it growing? Well, you never planted anything. Don't expect something to grow if you've never planted anything. So if you're here tonight, and maybe you're asking that question and you realized that you haven't been sowing, start sowing today. It's never too late to start sowing. It's never too late to start something. We have a mentality of just, hey, I'm too late. It's too late for me to learn something new. It's too late for me to grow. It's never too late for you to grow spiritually, never. Doesn't matter what age you are, where you're from, where you live. You can always be sowing into your spirit, so start that tonight. But maybe you're here and you have been sowing into your spirit, but you haven't been seeing the reaping. And you're not reaping what you're expecting. And you're going through a hardship, and you're going through a hard time in your life. I'd like to encourage you and say, God hasn't left you. He hasn't forsaken you. He hasn't forgotten about you. You might be looking like this complex Rubik's Cube, but there's a way out. There's a way to solve your complex problem today, regardless of what it is. There's no what, if, then, but, because, none of that. God says, through him, all things are possible. There's no comma. There's no some, depending. It's clear. All things are possible with God. How big is your God today? How big is your faith today? So I'd like us to end with a verse in Hebrews 13:5. It reads, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. God will never leave you. He hasn't forsaken you. And if you need Jesus tonight, don't go home without Jesus. Don't go to sleep without getting your life straight with God. Begin to grow like this seed. Begin to water that seed and start moving up where you can solve complex problems with God and be affecting other people around you. Let us stand up and pray.